To historians is granted a talent that even the gods are denied to alter what has already happened. Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone, and the Libertarian Institute. Today we'll be discussing cronyism in America from 1607 to 1849 by Dr. Patrick Newman. He is an assistant professor of economics at Florida Southern College and a fellow of the Mises Institute. Dr. Newman, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to be on your podcast.
What is cronyism?
So cronyism, the term itself just simply refers to special interest policies such as tariffs, taxes, discriminatory regulations, licensing, etc., that benefit certain interest groups at the expense of the public. Okay, so it's really just legislation that, although the motivation or the stated motivation might be to benefit the public interest, it's really just benefiting elites and other well-connected groups at the expense of the public, the general taxpayer, and so on.
Frederick Bastiat wrote a book titled Economic Harmonies. He says, government is the great fiction which through everybody endeavors to live at the expense of everybody else. Can you explain the significance of that quote?
Yeah, so the market, as I explained in my book, briefly in the introduction of my book, the market tends to benefit everyone. So the invisible hand, how under a framework of private property, self-interest benefits the general interest, it works. So profits and loss guide entrepreneurs to produce products that consumers want, and overall living standards increase if you allow the market to work. The government is very different. The government, it really is one group is benefiting at the expense of someone else, both ex ante at the time of action as well as ex post. And this is because government's ultimately built off of coercion. It's built off of force. It's not built off of voluntary decision-making and mutual agreement. So government enterprises breed inefficiency. They don't improve living standards. They intend basically favor the person running, the person with the political connections at the expense of the taxpayer and consumers who are deprived of the most efficient satisfaction of their wants.
What are historical narratives and why are they important?
So a historical narrative is really the way I describe it. It's sort of a it's an analysis of a particular period. So it's an empirical analysis. You're going through, okay, what happened and why. So what were the major, what were the relevant government policies or just human actions in history? What caused them? What caused people to, to act this certain way? And then what were their effects? What did that lead to, et cetera? So you could have a historical narrative on, say, even right now for something that just happened, last year regarding the most recent stimulus check. You could have a historical narrative on the Civil War. You could have a historical narrative on the Great Depression. It's basically just historians' analysis or their interpretation of various empirical events in our past.
I want to give you some historical narratives that were definitely generated to me in my earlier years. Tell me if these are accurate or inaccurate historical narratives. History shows we need a powerful state to regulate unfettered big business, which is corrupt inherently in relentlessly pursuing profit. We need to do this for the benefit of not just consumers, but for the workers.
I would say that's false. Something that I talk about in my book Cronyism, as well as other research that I have engaged in, is that the free market works. It tends to benefit everyone. It leads to lower price goods, improved quality of products, etc. And government intervention that's designed to protect the consumer or protect a business or workers, etc., is really just delaying that growth. So what it's trying to do is it's just trying to provide some sort of redistribution to benefit a group, whether or not it's the stated group they're trying to benefit. And this is going to hurt everyone overall. So regulations that are designed to, let's say, help the worker are either going to privilege a union and increase union wages at the expense of other workers who have to experience lower wages, improved working conditions according to some predetermined standard. This can raise costs of businesses and drive small firms out of business, raising prices to consumers and helping large companies, so on and so forth. So although this is how we're traditionally taught most legislation, it's designed to benefit the public. There are errors, there are flaws in capitalism that require sort of wise government oversight. In reality, most legislation is crony. It's captured and it's controlled by the relevant business, labor, bureaucracy, bureaucratic group, so on and so forth.
In the last year, I've learned that it wasn't just the elites trying to screw me. It was also my neighbors that will happily cheer for my peaceful actions to be heavily regulated. Is it accurate to say all government is therefore cronyism because it operates at the expense of other people instead of this harmony of interest that we get in the free market?
So in a profound sense, I would say you are correct. Because really government is crony. So for example, I'm an Austrian economist. I go off of the welfare theory of Murray Rothbard, which argues that, ex ante government can never increase social welfare, and ex post it tends not to. And yeah, I think that when you look at it, virtually all government legislation is some sort of redistribution benefiting one group at the expense of others. The only example, sometimes there are, genuine politicians, usually small rank, that have good intentions and it leads to bad outcomes, but that still leads to favoritism. And there are instances of government regulation that hurt everyone, but it could also disproportionately hurt some groups more than others. So I do think basically all government legislation is crony. All government actions are crony. I don't think that weakens the term cronyism. Some people might say that. I actually think it strengthens it, because what I'm trying to do is sort of show how cronyism is really linked with the government. It goes hand in hand with government intervention. It's really just another way of looking at government intervention.
Once you convince people that surely products and services will increase in quality and decrease in price over time as a causal result of private property and free exchange, they'll say, well, financial markets are different. These are very volatile. They're so complex. So next historical narrative. History shows we need a regulated financial market to avoid wildcat banking, overspeculation, and depressions. True or false?
False on all three accounts. So my dissertation was on monetary history. So this is, right up my alley. When you look at the so-called wildcat banking era, during the so-called free banking era, there's a couple things that need to be pointed out. One, it's that bank failures were actually quantitatively fairly small compared to later eras with government regulation. With more government regulation, and what problems during those wildcat banking era in the United States, at least, those were caused by government regulation. So one of the reasons you had a lot of inefficiency was you had branch banking prohibitions that led to very small unit banks being basically protected from outside competition. Banks were also required to back the amount of notes they issued, banknotes, with government bonds, which could often be of dubious value, and also made it them unable to respond to panics. I believe the second part you mentioned was relating to panics. Looking at panics in the United States, they were actually not caused by the absence of government oversight. They were caused by government regulation, in particular regarding the branch banking requirements, the branch banking prohibitions, or the requirements you have to back your notes with government bonds. This led the banking system to become very fragile. So when there was one problem in the banking sector, such as somewhere out west where some crop failures caused a couple regional banks to fail or something, this contagion would quickly spread to other banks. And the reason was because, due to various government regulations, banks held reserves at other banks. So they would quickly drain money out of that bank, which would cause that bank to drain money out of that bank. And then this would lead back to New York City and the stock market and so on. So you don't need a wise central, quote unquote, wise central government to prevent, to destabilize financial markets. When you actually look at it, the record shows that increasing government intervention destabilizes financial markets. When you have just the free market allowed to work, this promotes an incredible amount of economic efficiency in the financial sphere.
How is it that central banks cause recessions?
So central banks can cause recessions primarily through their credit expansion, or what they would like to call counter-cyclical monetary policy. So traditionally, most advocates of a central bank argue that the central bank needs to stabilize the money supply, to increase it during depressions, to decrease it during times of inflation, and this is all beneficial. This works out for the benefit of the public, et cetera. Many economists, particularly Austrians, such as myself, I consider myself an Austrian economist, argue that, well, what it really is when the central bank engages in expansionary monetary policy, this artificially lowers interest rates, and it misleads businesses into expanding in the projects that really aren't profitable. So it creates sort of a boom bust business cycle. You can see this. It's not quite what's going on right now as in the year 2021, but during the COVID pandemic, the government massively increased the money supply. So from March and April of 2020, especially when half the economy was basically shut down, they were enormously increasing the money supply. Since then up till now, the money supply M2 has increased by about 40% in a little bit less than 2 years, which is tremendous. And now this has caused a lot of inflation. People are upset about this. And the Federal Reserve is now going to have to engage in contractionary monetary policy. But when they do that, that's going to stop the easy sort of credit conditions they've created and lead to a recession. So we still see this now where central bank actions, though they might promote some sort of false prosperity in the short term, they end up always leading to recessionary consequences in the long term.
So easy credit leads to overexpansion, which leads to a depletion of resources that otherwise would have existed had there been a free market in interest rates. Is that?
Yeah, basically, the interest rates incentivize the low interest rates incentivize businesses to misuse the scarce resources available to them, to put them in long-term production, production processes that are not profitable if interest rates were at their actual normal level. And it encourages a misuse of resources, a squandering of resources that becomes apparent when the central bank raises interest rates. So during the housing bubble, basically an argument related to that in terms of, the real estate, the massive real estate bubble, was that because of the lower interest rates and the various other government policies designed to encourage home ownership and construction, building, real estate expansion, all of these scarce resources, lumber, bricks, construction materials, construction workers, et cetera, were devoted towards these houses that were too big and people couldn't afford them. So they're what's known as malinvestments.
Next historical narrative. Big business wants small government so they can screw the masses without repercussions.
That's false. That's something I've provided many examples of that in my book, Cronyism, as well as my other research. Big business, what they really do is they're in favor of regulations that will benefit them. So they want government subsidies such as bailouts, which large banks and the automotive companies were able to get during the financial crisis. Large companies were also able to get most of the Paycheck Protection Program loans during COVID, et cetera. So big business, they'll often engage in what I tell my students, offensive lobbying. So trying to secure cronyism. And they're also going to engage in defensive lobbying, which is trying to prevent their competitors from getting cronyism, or trying to prevent threatening legislation caused by other various groups. So, for example, we think of the canonical big business in the United States today, that's big tech. So Alphabet, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and I'm forgetting Apple. I think that's all of them. And So what they want is they're pushing for regulation right now that's going to raise compliance costs on new social media companies that have to adhere to certain algorithm standards or to prevent hate speech or other sorts of information that's deemed unacceptable. And big tech is in favor of that because they want to keep people on their platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube, so on and so forth. And they're also lobbying to prevent their companies from being broken up, right? Some politicians are shaking them down, so to speak, or socialists, whatever. So big tech is testifying in front of Congress to try to prevent antitrust from being thrust upon them. Or other sorts of unfavorable regulation. So big business isn't in favor of free markets. They play a complicated balancing act, but they're in favor of cronyism. Undeniably.
Rothbard famously disagreed with Ayn Rand, saying that big business, America's oh God, I forget. She said
business, America's most persecuted minority.
Most persecuted minority. Whereas Rothbard and Milton Friedman explicitly said socialism is alive because of big business and intellectuals. Would you agree that big business and intellectuals are the two driving forces of statism, socialism, and the institutionalized aggression against private property?
Yeah, absolutely. There's certainly, again, many intellectuals or other groups that big business are hostile to, things they do feel threatened by, so to speak. And I've mentioned, some examples of it before. But you look at, again, they're the main, in many ways, the main shapers behind legislation. They will take the initiative when it comes to legislation, or they will also be able to play the defensive and shape legislation to their interests. And you look at the rise of government intervention in the late 19th century, early 20th century, in many cases, it was big business taking the initiative, supporting regulation, supporting regulatory commissions that could control competitors, et cetera, and intellectuals who were supporting, government subsidies or a new system of social planning in which they would be able to basically secure jobs for themselves. So a lot of times when we talk about cronyism, we tend to focus on business, but it's important not to leave out politicians and bureaucrats and intellectuals who also have their own crony desires.
What is the alliance of throne and altar?
So the alliance of throne and altar refers to back in the day, it referred to how intellectuals, the government would basically employ court intellectuals to justify their interventions to the public. So the king would basically make a certain church established. This is the state church. People must support the state church. You must, listen to the priest, etc. And that would, of course, the king would give money to the priest to build a nice church. The priest would have the king's the king's ear. The priest would live a good life. And in turn, the priest would say, the king is divine. You have to listen to the king. You have to fight for the king. You have to pay taxes for the king. If you're conscripted, you have to go out and fight for the king in some foreign war, etc. So it was this alliance between the throne of government and the altar, right? So the religious groups, which at the time are really the only intellectuals, and this has continued into the modern era because nowadays, although there's not an explicit religious element in intellectuals and there is a separation of church and state, it's court intellectuals are basically academics employed by the government in state universities, et cetera, because governments give them cushy jobs, or sinecures as they're called. And in turn, those intellectuals justify the government. So they say, oh, you have to pay taxes. You have to wear a face mask. You have to adhere to this regulation. All of this is good. It might not, it's not because God said so, but it's because it's promoting the welfare of the public, et cetera. And in return, those universities will get cushy research grants and government subsidies, and those intellectuals will get nice jobs and so on and so forth. So the alliance refers to the connection between the government and intellectuals.
Final historical narrative. History shows us that economic growth is clearly correlated with consumer spending. My spending is your income. Your spending is my income. Therefore, an increase in spending and stimulus projects will make societies wealthier.
I would say that's false as well. So the basic error in that is it's not consumer spending that stimulates the economy. It's actually savings and investment. Okay, it's really savings that stimulate the economy, because it's when consumers decrease their consumption spending and increase their savings. So they postpone consumption and then they use it for investment, the creation of capital goods. This is going to lead to more capital goods being created, which in turn will lead to more consumer goods being created, which will lower prices. So the reason why Japan became very wealthy after World War II, right up until the 90s, and even now it's still like the third largest economy, as well as China since the 70s, has not been because their publics have been consuming more. It's because of very high savings rates. So when the public saves, this leads to sustainable economic growth. It leads to more capital goods, leads to lower interest rates, and it leads to what Austrians would call a longer structure of production. So stimulus and all sorts of government spending, et cetera, those only give the illusion of prosperity, because what they're really doing is they're decreasing savings, and it's leading into the increased production that whatever the government's spending money on, various government boondoggles, et cetera. So it really it's not consumption, it's savings that drives the economy.
Progressives will sometimes take that premise and come to a different conclusion. They say investment's vitally important, which is why the government, which has an unlimited money supply, should constantly invest. We need to double educational spending. We need to double infrastructure spending because investment is important. If we agree investment is important, why should we take the private approach as opposed to the government approach?
Right. So this is a great question. And it's sometimes brought up where you say, why shouldn't the government improve our nation's infrastructure? Why shouldn't the government build the roads, et cetera? So there's a couple of things here. One, a lot of people don't always realize this, and this is something that many progressives will dispute, but I think both theory and empirical evidence show it to be true. The private sector is just much more efficient than the government sector. It leads to lower prices, lower cost, and improved quality. Why? Basically because of competition and profit and loss. Entrepreneurs actually have signals, the price system, which they can use and interpret in order how to allocate scarce resources according to what consumers want. Okay, politicians and bureaucrats do not have that same the same feedback mechanism, nor do they have the same incentive structure. Government enterprises are supported through taxes. The government can just not illegally, it can just prohibit competition and make it illegal. Businesses can go bankrupt. Okay, even nonprofits, which don't survive on profits, but they can certainly get losses. Governments can't really do that because they're getting tax money, and they can basically keep themselves afloat through force, right? And this is when this extends even to something like infrastructure. So, why should the government actually build the roads? Why shouldn't the private sector build the roads? And why shouldn't we have private tolls and so on? Why do we need to keep putting money in the government for them to waste on infrastructure that later turns out to be unprofitable or requires more tax money, so on and so forth? So when you look at it this way, I think the case is actually very strong for the private sector to actually start to take over some of our infrastructure. They could rebuild it and repair it at lower cost and at proved efficiency for the average person.
Is there a grand historical narrative that libertarians can embrace to not just convince people intellectually with man, economy, and state, but also to pull at their heartstrings and really motivate them to get their hearts and minds on the side of freedom and voluntary exchange as opposed to compulsion and coercion?
Yeah. So, that's a great question. That's something I've been trying to do. So my book, Cronyism, Liberty versus Power in Early America, 1607 to 1849, is trying to at least go through that in early American history. I'm working on the sequel book of that, continuing it to the time period after that, because I do think that's something actually missing in sort of the libertarian movement, which is an overall historical narrative. You can find a dime a dozen, you can get books a dime a dozen from the liberal perspective of American history, talking about why you needed government intervention at this every twist and turn, or even a neoconservative perspective, explain why we needed to intervene in these foreign wars, or why government was good, in this case, and so on. But the general libertarian history is missing. Murray Rothbard tried to work on that. Conceived in Liberty was originally supposed to be just a 1 to 2 volume history of America. It became a 5-volume history on early colonial America. I'm hoping to basically be able to craft the narrative that I could then package and give to people, because I do think your average person learns more through history than through pure economic theory. This isn't to disparage economic theory. I am an economist, but it's just to recognize the reality that we live in.
Yeah, Hayek's point in Capitalism and the Historians was to say that historians almost have more of an impact on the public than economic theorists, because historians give people ideas that they don't even question. We had child labor, then we had child labor laws, now there's not child labor. Therefore, government child labor is the reason we don't have children working 16 hours a day in factories. So yeah, I definitely think it's vitally important. What do you think about if Marx says history is the story of class struggles, and then tries to pit the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, and today it's white versus black, men versus women, and everything else that's evil and arbitrary? What do you think about history is the struggle since the days of ancient Egypt up to your modern kidnapper of Ghislaine Maxwell? It is a battle between people who engage in the realm of peaceful voluntary exchange and initiating violence to achieve their ends. Can't we just take our theory and apply it to all historical analyses as well?
I think in a grand macro sense, you can. I mean, that's in a sense, I think the theory that you've just described is the liberty versus power theory that Murray Rothbard articulated, that Lord Acton articulated, that many colonists in American history and early Americans articulated, Jeffersonians, Jacksonians, etc. History is the struggle between the forces of basically voluntary decision-making, decentralized government, free markets, et cetera, and the forces of government coercion, cronyism, and so on. And that when you see progress in mankind, this is when the forces of liberty and the free market win, versus when you see the power wins, this is when you see retrogression, stagnation, et cetera. So I agree. I do think there are theories that can explain things in more detail better, but as an overarching theory in which everything from our perspective is subsumed under, I agree. And that's, I call it, it's the liberty versus power theory. I really think it can be boiled down into that, but I think that's really the theory your average libertarian is in a sense articulating.
What is important about the research of concentrated costs and dispersed benefits?
Well, it's a simple analysis that explains, okay, why does a particular government legislation pass? So why would one type of government legislation pass, but other types of government legislation wouldn't pass? This goes into sort of like a what's known as public choice, but the idea is that, well, if you have one group that's getting most of the benefits from the legislation, they're really going to push for it. And let's say there's a subsidy that's going to benefit, bail out some automotive company, just airline company or whatever. They're really going to lobby for it. They're really going to push for it because they are the ones getting most of the benefits, if not all of them. At the same time, let's say it's $100 billion or, whatever. This is going to be spread out in the form of costs, either through taxes over everyone, which will generally be dispersed, or through borrowing, which people won't even realize. Interest rates will go up a little bit, or printing money, et cetera. So your average person isn't really going to spend that much time fighting it, right? So this is why government legislation provides concentrated benefits at dispersed costs. These are the types of policies that actually can get through Congress.
Yeah, it's the old, I always drive by this Northrop Grumman here in Chandler. It makes me sick every time. One might ask, well, why would they push for, the military industrial complex, all these big contracts, and why would they push for these wars if they don't benefit the society that they live in? Isn't it in their interest to have a good society for them and their kids? It's like, yes, but if that part affects them one millionth of the multi-billion-dollar contract that they got on the other side. That's what I love about this book so much. Cronyism, Liberty versus Power in Early America, 1607 to 1849, because it really gets into that. And you go, well, certainly people just allowed this sort of thing to happen then. Well, is that happening today? What are the biggest acts of cronyism you see today between big business and big government?
Well, I think that a tremendous amount of cronyism came from the government's policies regarding COVID, right? So the lockdowns that were in place in the various fiscal and monetary stimulus. So the government argued that, okay, there's this virus that seemingly came out of nowhere. And this now requires us to lock down the economy and to enforce various social distancing and vaccine requirements, etc. Well, you just go through the list of the people benefiting from that, of the industries benefiting from that. There's been no surprise that companies, like Amazon and other sorts of e-commerce companies are the biggest proponents of sort of maintaining these measures, because it's going to encourage more people to buy online. It's no surprise that the lockdown itself, as well as the various social distancing, mask requirements, even vaccine compliance some businesses have to adhere to, hurt smaller businesses generally more than larger businesses. Okay. It's no surprise that the Federal Reserve's massive monetary easing has generally benefited Wall Street or large financial banks. They had a very good year in 2020, and especially with the Federal Reserve continuing to purchase about 120 billion in mortgage-backed securities and government securities each month this year. And now you're seeing various cronyism relating to vaccines, where there are various companies, they're getting subsidies from the government. There's this people are arguing that there's this incentive for these companies to keep pushing vaccines because they're getting more money from the government, or they're getting certain contracts and so on. This is all, of course, being hotly challenged and debated, but that doesn't mean that it's not an issue, or that people aren't upset at the way these various policies have redistributed wealth, generally from the poor to the wealthier groups over the past 2 years. So I would say those are kind of like the biggest forms of cronyism. You can also see right now there has been a lot of cronyism regarding the infrastructure bill, Biden's Build Back Better, because if they're planning on building, repairing roads or bridges, etc., well, the government's got to hire out contractors. It's got to hire out contractors, basically pay various companies. And there's been a lot of speculation and sort of behind the scenes dealing as companies are kind of wrangling to see if they can be the ones that get money from the government. Politicians also often support infrastructure when, of course, there's going to be a road in a certain area and they can buy land near there and so on. So I would say many of the policies you read about in the news, your average person reads about in the news, they're justified by appealing to the public interest, but the actual motivations are often a little bit more, much more sinister.
It's amazing how you have politicians pushing the products by Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson. And then if the product does not give their general, but what they told us would happen more or less, of we need to get this vaccine, this way we can get things back to normal. When that doesn't work, they blame the people who didn't take the product. They didn't blame Big Pharma, who the left was railing against, 10 years ago, occupying Wall Street, down with the 1%. Now they're defending Big Pharma and hating their neighbor, who I thought was a proletariat comrade who we're supposed to join in the struggle against. They've completely used this cronyism method, as Tho Bishop says, to weaponize companies against the public interest. That's what I love about this book so much, is that it's not something that started under Trump or Bush. I remember when I was a Democrat, everything was good until George Bush, and that son of a gun just made things bad for the first time in history. This really goes into so many of those examples. On page 27, you describe clear acts of cronyism, just all these navigation acts, all these tariffs that are very specific. They're very specific because they benefit some at the expense of others. At the time, how were these acts sold to the public?
Well, so it was a little bit different back then because in the colonial era, particularly when there was a king, or then there was also a parliament, they were mainly they didn't necessarily need to be sold to the public, so to speak, because there wasn't really a democracy, right? If you had a king or if you had parliament, which was Britain, in Britain, and then the colonists, it's sort of like, well, we don't need to sell it to you. It's almost like everything here is a privilege. You guys being here in the colonies is a privilege. You're benefiting from our protection. You're benefiting from our military. So you have to cough up, right? And that's how that eventually led to the American Revolution, because after the French and Indian War, Great Britain basically tried to push what was called the Grand Design. They were actually going to enforce all these laws that had been on the books. And the public was basically upset at this because they weren't buying how the government was justifying it, saying like, oh, we're here for your protection, etc. So they didn't need to use as much propaganda, let's say, because the public was already sort of seen as an outsider. Great Britain didn't need to appeal to them. They didn't have any say in the government, your average colonist, right? And Britain thought that they had the biggest army. So if they tried to resist, well, they would just basically send in the troops and sort of quell dissent. But they would go through by saying, well, this is protecting British industry, which is protecting you indirectly, and so on. But the public interest arguments didn't need to be as convoluted as they are now.
You mention in your book discussing cronyism both monetary profit and psychic profit. What is psychic profit?
So psychic profit, really, it just refers to the satisfaction you get when the outcome that you receive is greater than the opportunity cost. So, for example, I teach my students, every action, you're always trying to get some sort of net benefit. You're always valuing the choice you're taking more than your opportunity cost, which is basically the next best choice, or it's the highest ranked alternative, right? So I could be on this podcast, I could have done something else within this hour, and let's say at the end of this podcast, which I am enjoying it, so I'll say, oh, I like this, I thought this was a good use of my time, I earn a psychic profit, right? Just like psychic satisfaction. On the other hand, if I don't enjoy it and I say, well, this is a waste, I could have done X, Y, and Z, then you earn a loss. In terms of cronyism, a lot of times, and this is a problem with economists because the discipline is very mathematical, they're always going to try to, if you compute everything in terms of dollars and cents or something quantitative, not saying that's obviously how a lot of cronyism is done, money talks, but a great deal of other cronyism can come from various psychic dimensions. So a bureaucrat could be interested in increasing the size of their bureaucracy in order to enhance their own prestige, right? So the head bureaucrat. So, for example, Anthony Fauci, one of the things a lot of people would say is crony about him. Yeah, he could be making money on the side through something else, but he's not becoming like a billionaire through this. He's increasing his power over people's lives, which is some sort of psychic enjoyment, right? Certain people enjoy that, and they like to they like to sleep at night knowing that, oh yeah, I've got divisions X, Y, and Z under me, and they've each got 500 employees and blah 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 blah, and look how important I am, and etc. And same sense, politicians can also engage in a crony action against their competitors, not because they're trying to make money, but simply because of revenge. I've written a paper explaining that one of the reasons why John Sherman, famous Ohio congressman or senator, pushed for antitrust legislation, the famous 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act, was because he was trying to screw a political competitor that was competing for him in the Republican presidential nomination. And this guy was linked with an unpopular company that could be broken up with antitrust, in so many words. So these types of motivations do exist, right? The reason why, you can get to the present day revenge trying to hurt someone just so you can get some sort of enjoyment from that. That is something that exists. So that's what could be subsumed in terms of strict economic theory as under under psychic profit.
On page 61, you mention, finally, an elite Supreme Court appointed by the president for life, lorded over the judicial branch, and could review state and federal laws' constitutionality. You refer to this as a fatal blow to states' rights. Why is the Supreme Court, someone there to protect our rights, a fatal blow to states' rights, and why is that a problem?
Well, the issue is because it's a federal court system that won. So a lot of people don't realize this is one, the Supreme Court's not in the Constitution. The Constitution just gives Congress the power to create a Supreme Court. Just like there's no preordained number of Supreme Court justices. We've been changing those things, throughout most of American history. But the idea is that a federal court system supersedes state court systems, and it basically provides for this additional power structure that now it's the final arbiter. So the Supreme Court really just provides justification for most federal cronyism by saying, well, it's constitutional. You can do this, X, Y, the government could do X, Y, and Z. This is good, etc. And that once the Supreme Court rules on this, there's really nothing else you can do aside from various forms of resistance or potentially trying to challenge the law. But that's something constitutionally, but that's something that's very hard to do. So the Supreme Court is this was a huge worry back then, which is why many radicals, at least initially, wanted to try to get rid of the 1789 Judiciary Act. But having one court where its people are appointed for life and they can basically lord over our policies, the reviewing various policies is extremely problematic. Because an additional reason of this is so-called federalism. The legislature and the executive and the judiciary, they all check each other through checks and balances and et cetera. But as Rothbard points out, there's nothing preventing them from working together, right? And then the three branches of the federal government screw the states and the people. In fact, that's actually what's happened throughout history. They don't really check the power of the other branches.
What can libertarians learn from the past strategies of freedom fighters from 1607 to 1849?
Well, I think your average libertarian today can understand that, things such as local resistance, secession, nullification, etc. These are really going to be the only major effective strategies, because in the past, this is what was championed by many people, having various decentralized governments, or what Thomas Jefferson called the Empire of Liberty. And more importantly, during the Jeffersonian and the Jacksonian years, they actually did try to reform Washington, and they had a much greater chance of succeeding than we do now. People were just more predisposed to see the free market or decentralized government, et cetera, and yet they still failed, right? So if they failed, how on earth are we going to succeed in trying to reform Washington or something like that, et cetera? So it really just shows is that the only options are for trying to put more control back on the local level and trying to get people to break away from governments. Okay. And that's really kind of the main takeaway in terms of any sort of long-term solution. We could get into more specifics regarding constitutional safeguards, et cetera. And I do talk about that in my book, what people were able to do, particularly regarding state constitutions in the 1840s. But that's the main thing, is that decentralization is really the only option.
That is one of the most incredible scams that I think I've come across, where we'll hear about monopolies are terrible and really dangerous, and we need a government to stop monopolies. By the way, law should be monopolized by Washington, D.C. And colonialism is really bad. We need the African people to gain their independence. Also, some people in D.C. have the right to rule over all 50 states. If anyone tries to resist, they're a January 6th insurrectionist. How have such blatant contradictions been sold to people in a first world country with high degrees?
Well, what it really comes down to is it just comes down to the fact that people. So I've experienced this frustration before, and one of the ways, at least, I'm able to go to sleep at night in terms of not stressing myself out or wondering how could this be changed is that, look, half the population has an IQ below the average, right? It just has to be true, right? There's no way around it. Half the population is above average weight. Half the population has below average looks, whatever, right? So half the population is already below the average IQ. So they're going to be more susceptible to, simple arguments that are appealing to the public interest or from respectable news outlets. They're going to listen to celebrities and other people they look up to, etc. So you've got that. Then you've got the other part of the above average IQ people who are wanting to take advantage of other people, and they're going to spin them these lies, etc. So what it comes down to basically a communication battle. And a big factor in this, unfortunately, is just the fact that the other side has access to a lot more money. And so that's giving them the ability to produce more news outlets, produce more intellectuals to research and advocate things that can fund politicians more, so on and so forth. But it's really a battle for ideas. And your average person, I think, is just swept up in this fact that, government can help. And more government is almost always the solution. Your average person is not religious anymore, but I will say that religion's been channeled into a sort of different angle, more secular, is that they don't worship God, they worship government. Okay.
Looking at the history of big business in America, or any business seeking to benefit not through voluntary exchanges, but through things like cronyism, what can we learn from the history of charters?
So the charter, this is really related to the history of cronyism, is that charters they're basically licenses. So if you wanted to create a corporation back in the day, and by a corporation, I'm referring to there's multiple owners. You can buy and sell ownership, as in stock. And there's something known as limited liability, which is that the stockholders are only liable up to the amount they put in the company. So if you own Apple stock and Apple goes bankrupt, the worst that happens to you is the value of your stock goes down. You don't owe the creditors any money, right? So this can be something that could be just done through voluntary exchange. But you also, back in the day, you had the governments. They would basically say, in order for you to run a corporation, you have to apply for a charter from us. And these were very inefficient licenses. It led to a lot of corruption. It obviously led to regional monopolies and so on, because they could forcibly block out competition and raise prices above what the free market would have led to. And that this is why ultimately corporations were looked upon suspiciously in early American history. Not necessarily because they were big, but because they were connected with the government. So, when you had these large corporations, such as during the Civil War, when these major transcontinental railroads were chartered with enormous amounts of government aid through land grants or subsidies, etc. And a lot of people were upset at this, right? And they were upset because it's like, why is the government privileging these massive companies with these charters, right? And so that's ultimately where America's revulsion against corporations comes from. It comes from the chartering system.
That's an amazing scam as well. It's terrible and evil and burdensome to need a driver's license to vote, and it hurts the poor. But needing to get a license from DC to operate any product and service exchanges, well, that just helps people. That doesn't hurt the poor. The poor are unaffected. Sam Walton's the one who's really terrified we're going to put another license on him. Oh, he passed away. I should have said Bezos. What is... I'm sorry, one more before that. What is the water diamond paradox, and why is it important?
Oh, the diamond water paradox. Okay. So this refers to the fact that, all right, so you've got in classical economics, or really just throughout most of the history of economic thought, people were wondering, all right, where the value of goods comes from. So in terms of value, referring to the price. Why is a chair priced at X dollars? Why is bread priced at $1? Why are diamonds priced at $1,000, etc.? Okay. So initially, some people would argue that it's because of utility. It's because goods are priced more if they provide more utility to the consumer. So then people say, okay, but why are diamonds priced more than water? So why is a bottle of water cost $1 versus $1,000 for a diamond, when clearly a water provides more utility or seen as more useful in life? You need water to survive, right? So economists, most famously Adam Smith, said, okay, the connection between use value, so what you can use for personal consumption utility, is separate from exchange value, what it can be exchanged for on the market, the price. So then this led to, you need, it's the labor, the amount of labor that's put in that explains the price. But in reality, it's not necessarily utility that explains value. It's marginal utility that explains value. So the reason why water, which is so much more useful than diamonds, is priced lower is just because there's a much more abundant supply of water. Right. So on the margin, you're not choosing between only water and diamonds. You're choosing between a bottle of water and a handful of diamonds. Most people are going to go with the diamonds because those diamonds satisfy much more highly valued ends than just one bottle of water. Okay. So that's the basics behind the diamond water paradox. And it really kind of hurt economics for a long time until the marginal revolution in 1871, particularly Karl Menger, which really sort of hammered home the point that it's marginal utility that explains price.
The reason I think that's so important in our discussion of cronyism is because people will often see that big business is about money and we got to stamp those people out. They're really the enemy, so that's who we need to combat. When really, they'll say things like, we want healthcare for all. So in other words, they're saying screw the supply, screw the producers, and focus on demand. Well, if there is no supply of something, you can demand it all you want. You're the guy stranded on an island demanding Ruth's Chris prime rib. So this hatred of producers and this no caring of the supply, people in their own neighborhoods, throwing bricks in to innocent stores because of something the evil cops did or something like that. Well, how is it that we've grown to hate the producers and love the parasites or the politicians and their collaborators?
Well, I think it's because America is becoming more and more anti-capitalist. We also don't see the significance of how much businesses and capitalism provides for our standard of living. So there was sort of a social philosopher around the 1920s, 1930s. His name was Ortega y Gasset, I believe. And he basically argued that, a lot of people, they just sort of assume that all the amazing technological progress that has occurred over the past, he was speaking in 1930, so it was like past 150 years, but we can extend this till now. So since like 1800, the past 220 years is just sort of automatic. Life's always been getting better and life will always get better. Not realizing that it's actually the institutions that are protecting private property and incentivizing people to transform it and improve people's for them to make money, which indirectly, for them to make money, which leads to increases in satisfaction of other people. This is actually the reason why technological progress has occurred. This is the reason why you now have an iPhone. This is the reason why you and I are having an interview and we're not even in the same room. Right, we're not even in the same state, so this technological progress will only continue to occur as long as we embrace capitalism. Your average person doesn't know that. The news media doesn't teach them that. The public school system or colleges, by and large, they don't teach them that stuff. So they're instead just going to have a general, it's always the evil supplier. It's the market's always looking to screw the person. This is why you see now that there's high inflation, almost like clockwork, Democratic politicians, they're saying, oh, it's greedy companies. It's consolidation. It's greedy companies. That's what's causing it. The high meat prices are caused by corporate greed, which is, it's completely incorrect.
What are real world examples of free market policies making one population go from poverty to wealth?
Well, I think in terms of the most recent example of that would have to be, to some extent, China. Although there are many problems with the Chinese government now, it's certainly not a free market compared to the 1970s when it was full communism. The country was very agrarian, it was very poor. The country in the 80s, starting under Deng Xiaoping, I believe, instituted various market reforms, allowing for more private property, allowing for shops, allowing foreign investment to come in through special development, special economic zones, etc. This was a major move towards capitalism, which led to a huge increase in the wealth of people from China. You can even see on a much more smaller level and more recent, something like Uber, which really is in a sense a deregulation of the taxi industry. Right, they were able to find a legal loophole that allowed them to evade taxi laws, and now everyone's using Uber, and we're now able to get around through various Uber and Lyft and other ride-sharing apps because the market was deregulated. In fares, it's become, the quality's gone up. People are, they prefer to use it. It's becoming over time, you would say relatively cheaper, especially if there's going to be automation in the automotive industry, et cetera. So even just that one simple sort of deregulation has led to huge increases in the standard of living.
Why should we privatize the money supply?
In so many words, money is one half of all exchanges. So when you screw up money, you screw up one half of all exchanges, right? And when you should privatize the money supply, because actually the private money will lead to less distortions in the money supply and less inflation, right? Using a commodity money, using gold or Bitcoin, et cetera, it's going to prevent price increases. All right. When the government's in control of the money supply, they can print the money supply and they can distribute it to their favorite supporters or to themselves. It increases their real income at the expense of everyone else. This is the inflation tax. So during COVID, the Federal Reserve printed a bunch of money, and it mainly went to Wall Street banks and other large businesses that were able to get loans through the PPP loans and so on. The Paycheck Protection Program. And now we're starting to basically see that, well, it's redistributing income away from various groups, okay, to those, the initial receivers of the money. So inflation is a hidden tax, and the governments are inherently inflationary when they control the money supply.
What is an example of private money besides Bitcoin? Is it fair to say like casino chips or something like that would be what would be private money?
Well, I think an example of private money would have to be private banknotes and deposits back in the day. You don't see as much quote unquote private money now simply because governments don't allow it, right? You have to use fiat currency, to pay your taxes and to buy various goods and services. I'll say there's various payment programs that are private, and this has led to a huge increase in efficiency. So for example, you and I can exchange money, admittedly private, but we can also exchange private money like Bitcoin through our phones, right? Just through a really simple, basically program that, we don't have to go through a bank. We don't have to go through a third party, a third party connected with the government, et cetera. And this is a huge increase in efficiency. So there are private payment payment systems now. Hopefully there will be more private money or people using private money. I do think the governments around the world, not just the United States, are going to really try to stop that at all costs.
The book is Cronyism, Liberty versus Power in Early America. Two more questions for you, sir. What is the most important thing you learned from Dr. Joseph Salerno?
Great question. Most important thing I learned from Dr. Salerno is really just because I'm working on a project with him on man, economy, and state. It's really just an appreciation and an understanding of Rothbard's theoretical structure in man, economy, and state. And also Rothbard's analysis of history, which I've been very influenced by. I was very influenced by Salerno's introduction to Rothbard's book, posthumous book, A History of Money and Banking in the United States, right? So it's really just teaching, distilling Misesian and Rothbardian economics. I'd say that's my biggest influence from Joe Salerno, and that's obviously a very big influence.
And finally, the most important intellectual contribution of Murray Rothbard.
Good question. I would have to say his most important intellectual contribution, to go with sort of, is really, I would say, is developing his whole production theory. I think if you read Man, Economy, and State, and also various people's criticisms of Man, Economy, and State, such as Brian Kaplan and David Friedman, both of them who I know and I have enormous respect for, they don't really concentrate on Rothbard's production theory, which is actually the bulk of Man, Economy, and State. It's from chapters 5 really through chapter 10, if you include his monopoly stuff. But this huge production edifice, really in a grounding it on pure Austrian lines, describing the capitalist entrepreneur, describing the structure of production, and all of this other good stuff, is a really important feat in Austrian economics.
Cronyism, Liberty versus Power in Early America. Link in the description below. Thanks to everyone for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. Dr. Newman, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me on. And you can always follow me on @Dr. Patrick Newman on Twitter.